Greetings, this is Pastor Jared at New Life Presbyterian Church. I had done some of these videos in the past and on different themes such as hymns or on different psalms. And I had stopped doing them because it seemed like things were opening up again, but we still find ourselves fairly homebound these days. We still find that our Sunday school has not started yet. So I thought for a little bit longer, maybe I would do a few more of these videos. And we've done different themes, such as the hymns, such as the Psalms, and I thought I would do a series on recommendations on maybe something that you don't do very often, which is reading a good book and reading a good Christian book. What were some of the classics? What are some of my favorite books? Some books that perhaps every Christian should read at some point. And this was kind of sparked because of an event that happened this past week. There was a man who died, who some of you may have heard of and some may not have, named J.I. Packer. He was 93 years old and he passed away this past week. His final words that he wanted recorded were four, which was glorify Christ every way, which I think was a good epitaph for him. But why? What was the big deal about J.I. Packer? Why would people know him? Well, I knew him partly because of his books and influence, and he was influential for me through a few of his works. He started off in the Church of England before moving to Canada, Vancouver area, and teaching in seminaries there, being very influential in the American church. And he was influential because of his just clarity, his orthodoxy, and his helpfulness in some of the things that he wrote about. He wrote, at least in my life, something that was helpful was A Quest for Godliness, in which he goes through some of the Puritans and why they're useful. In fact, in the future, I think I may talk a little bit more about a couple of Puritans that may be worth reading, and our view of them may be skewed, but he actually read them and found a lot that was really good and helpful in them. And some of those reflections were put into a book that was his best known book. That was a huge seller. Over 1 million copies of this have been sold, and it's called Knowing God. If you know who J.I. Packer is, likely this was your introduction to him, was this book, Knowing God. I remember reading this book when I was in college, and this was a revolution for me because God had been something of a distant concept for me, a principle of morality, but not really all that much of a personal God. And when you read through here, he does something that doesn't seem like it would be very personal, but ends up being very personal. He goes through certain attributes of God, talks about his unchangeableness, his wisdom, him as judge, his love, his grace. And as he's going through these attributes, he's not just laying them out coldly, he's showing how they connect to real life. He uses a lot of hymns in the book, and that connection of theology to hymns gave me a new love for hymns. And so Packer was somebody that gave me an abiding love for hymns. It's one of the reasons I will never be one to say we have to throw out the hymn book entirely. Maybe we put some new tunes to them, but there's so much good theology in hymns, and I was taught that partly from the book Knowing God. I think every Christian should read this at some point in their life. We taught a Sunday school class in which the elders went through the different chapters of Knowing God. And so some of you were exposed to it that way. But if not, this is in our library. You could check this out. Perhaps buy it. It's like $10 on Amazon. This is a book that's really worth going through. And if you're wanting to go deeper, but without being challenged by too many big words and too many Latin phrases, I think you'll really like Knowing God. And that's what I would recommend to everybody. One other book that he wrote, though, that if you're struggling with something in particular that's helpful, is Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God. The question that always comes up whenever you start talking about evangelism is, well, if God is sovereign, why should we evangelize? And Packer does a really good job in just thinking through why we evangelize, God's command of it, how God works through means. And after you get done reading it, you really have been given so many answers and so much scripture and so much logic to why evangelism and the sovereignty of God are not two things that work against each other, but work together. So this is, I think, his second best book that especially if you're struggling with that question. This is a great book. I have 2 copies of this. I'll give you one if you want one to read. A really good book on that topic. The final thing that Packer did that is influential today, though, that you may know about, is he was the editor for a recent Bible translation. And that Bible translation was the ESV, the Pew Bible that we have in our sanctuary. And he didn't do all the translation work, but he was the editor for it. I love a story that was out there of Packer was giving talks, and people would go up and have him sign Knowing God or Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God to have his signature on it. And there was somebody that was there that had really appreciated the work that he did as an editor on the ESV translation, and went up to him and handed him a copy of the ESV to sign. And said he stood there with his pen for a moment and then handed back the Bible to him and said, "I can't sign this. I'm not the author." I thought it was a great story of Packer. When he passed away, it's one of those last giants. This is a guy who had listened to the lectures of C.S. Lewis in England, and about the only other person I think on his universal level in the English language as he passed. I think he's worth reading today. He still has things to teach us today, especially in his 2 books that I don't think have ever been topped on those 2 subjects. So if you have a chance, pick up Knowing God, either buy it or this is in our library. If you want one of these, I've got 2 copies. You can borrow them or even take one of them and read about what he's blessed the church with. This is a great time to be reading and appreciating more of the time that we have to think more deeply about God, so that our faith isn't razor thin. So many times we only give God about half an hour of our mind throughout the week as we listen to a sermon or part of the worship service. Let's go deeper. Let's read some good books. And this would be one of my first suggestions of where to go in Knowing God. Hopefully this will be a helpful series in the future, but that would be my first recommendation is J.I. Packer and Knowing God. Thanks for listening.